Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Good to have you with us as we do a study in the book of Titus. Titus and 1 Timothy were written about the same time. Titus was to back up what was being done on the Isle of Crete, and 1 Timothy was sent to Timothy at Ephesus to back up what he was doing. Titus on the Isle of Crete was setting up brand new churches. Timothy, on the other hand, was setting up eldership in churches that had been damaged by faulty elders, people who were teaching false doctrine. Therefore, in each book, Titus and Timothy, there was a listing of the qualifications of an elder. They don't differ very much at all, but there are a few things that we'll note along the way. And therefore, we are thankful that there was a problem at the church of Ephesus. And we are thankful that Titus was setting up churches from the very beginning. And each one of these books had qualifications of an elder. It can't be overemphasized how important having proper elders in a church is. And when you make mistakes in this area, when you ignore what has clearly been stated in the Bible, when you try to spin the passages to say something that's more to your liking, more culturally acceptable, whole denominations are paying the penalties now of ignoring what was clearly stated in the Bible. There's also many denominations and groups of churches that have spun these passages to suit them, and the church is being despoiled by the enemy, Satan, and much damage has been done. Therefore, it's very important for us to look at these passages and look at them how they were understood in the first century, and not allow modern social mores to dictate to the church what they think should be acceptable in an elder. Rather, we should look at what the passage says and do what it says. And as a result, I have to deal with a lot of unpleasant things that point out difficulties in how they spin the passage. Normally, I don't do this. I just preach what the passage means, in my opinion, and I don't throw sand up in the air, and then people have all these varying opinions and like balls in the air, and finally I grab one and I say, this is the right ball. Well, my friends, that's kind of a little bit what I'm doing here in this message. And so I want to be very careful as I develop these passages. I have to look at the original language and the intent of what it means. And because there have been grave mistakes made in many denominations, there are people that might be listening to me preach this on this passage, and they won't like what I have to say. Frankly, I'm not preaching this passage to please anybody but God. And so this is what I'm doing. I'm preaching what God is meaning here. And if you don't like what I have to say, then you need to study the passage as intensely as I have. Now, that doesn't in and of itself make me right, but I am a person who wants to study to show myself approved, a workman who needeth not to be ashamed before God. And so just keep that in mind and the body of work that I have done in my preaching so that you may trust what I have to say. The qualifications for an elder are to uphold proper conduct in marriage and family. So the eldership is very important to the health of the church, and the men that are chosen for eldership should properly model and uphold the family in the church. And not everyone, even if they aspire to be an elder, is qualified because of mistakes that they have made with their life that stick to them. And as a result, we can't necessarily be magnanimous because the picture of its importance is much bigger than just whether it might hurt their feelings or not. So it says here in Titus chapter 1 and verse 5, "For this reason I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you, namely, if any man is above reproach, the husband of one wife, having children who believe, not accused of dissipation or rebellion. But for the overseer must be above reproach, as God's stewards." So now we are going to be looking at this. There are two places where it says above reproach. And so these elders are to be above reproach. Now, 1 Timothy 3, verse 2, and Titus chapter 1, verse 6, especially in the New American Standard, translate must be above reproach. But they're two different Greek words. And so we perhaps ought to look at these two Greek words, although they are very similar. They're even translated similarly in the English language. They do have some slight variations. And Titus 1 is the Greek word anegkletos. I said that very slowly. Which is an alpha privative that makes things negative. And then you have neg, which sounds like negative. And then you have kletos. Kletos means to be called. Neg kind of puts you in mind of negative. And means not. So that basically means not any negative thing said about him. Not called against. Nothing called against them, or nothing negative said about them. And so it's translated above reproach. It means there's nothing that sticks to them. The Greek word in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 2 is anepilampton, and it's from alpha negative, alpha privative, and then you have that ne sound in there that might put you in the mind of negative, but nepi, it's epi, which is the word for upon, and then you have lambano. That gets a little complicated, but it basically means not upon, cannot be grasped. So cannot be taken a hold of. That's what that word means. So it's translated above reproach. Now, that means there is nothing whereby he is called into account. There's nothing that sticks to him. Some of these things, some of the little things that pastors do, doesn't really stench up the situation too much. Maybe there's a moment, let's say that in a 20-year period of a pastor's life, he loses his cool once, like in a business meeting, or he had a bit of pride, or he got defensive when someone said something to him that wasn't a bit negative, or he might have missed a visit, We're not talking about these things. We're not talking about, you know, big stuff. The pastor is not having to be considered sinless. He can have a bad thought once in a while. He can kind of dislike somebody in the church, but he hides it. It's not anything that isn't manageable. He doesn't have gross hypocrisy. He isn't a thief. He's not an adulterer on the side. There's just anything that can be grasped about him to bring him down, or his testimony cannot be smudged. This does not mean, once again, that he's sinless, but his sins are manageable and not sensational, bringing dishonor to the office. And this extends to how he runs his family, how he raises his church, raises his kids, how he manages his money, pays his bills. So he doesn't have anything sensational about him, because believe me, friends, he has as a spiritual leader, he is under satanic attack, and he will be a target. You could look at 1 Peter 5, verses 6 through 10. It talks about, that Satan is like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour, and he is especially interested in bringing down the pastor. So you destroy the shepherd and the sheep are scattered. So Satan will exploit any inconsistency, weakness, or hypocrisy and amplify it if he possibly can. It's a very high standard, and not every man can meet that. Instead of saying, well, that's not fair, I'm a pretty good person too, although I have this and this problem. Instead, we should say, praise the Lord, we have even a man or two that can meet this standard, and we should thank God for them and their leadership. And even though we would like to be an elder, but we can't, we should praise God for these men and pray for them. And they are guardians of the church. So reproach in some areas never goes away. There's a passage of scripture found in Proverbs chapter 6. I invite you to turn there. Well, I'll never get to it that way. Proverbs chapter 6. Starting with verse. I want to back up enough. Verse 30. Men, do not despise a thief if he steals, to satisfy himself when he is hungry. But when he is found, he must repay sevenfold. He must give all of the substance of his house, but he can make restitution. On the other hand, verse 32, the one who commits adultery with a woman is lacking sense. He who would destroy himself does it. Well, that's interesting. So if you commit adultery with another man's wife, you're lacking sense, and in some way you destroy yourself. Verse 33, wounds and disgrace he will find, and his reproach, there's our word, and his reproach will not be blotted out. A thief can make restitution, pay something 7 times over, and maybe that's done. But when it comes to adultery, what are you going to give to a man that'll make him be okay with you in that you violated him and slept with his wife. Verse 34, for jealousy enrages a man, and he will not spare in the day of vengeance. Can't be bought off. He will not accept any ransom, nor will he be satisfied though you give him many gifts. So it sticks to him. It's not like a thief who can make some type of restitution. This just stays with you. Let me give you a couple situations. Genesis chapter 49. Genesis 49. Now, Israel, or Jacob, he's at the end of his life. He gathers his sons around him, and he makes prophecies, and he says some good and some negative things about his sons. And he starts with his firstborn son, and his firstborn son's name is Reuben. And in Genesis 49 and verse 3, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power, uncontrolled as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed. He slept with one of Abraham's wives. It was a slave woman that he slept with to have children because his wife had become barren. And so you slept with one of your went up to your father's bed. Then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. This was 43 years ago. And because of something he did 43 years ago, he was not given the preeminent position of head of the family, and he was deposed. And so even though it was 43 years ago, it's something that stuck to him, and it's something that was in the craw of Israel, Jacob his father, that he should not have ought to done. In 1 Kings chapter 5, it talks about David. 1 Kings chapter 15. 1 Kings 15 and verse 5. God loved David. David had done many great things for the Lord, and his heart was after the Lord. But it says here, because David did what was right in the sight of the Lord, and had not turned aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite. It stuck. So that was carried forward. And Nehemiah, some 500 years later, he has something he wants to say. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. I'm looking at Nehemiah chapter 13. And he was very upset with the priesthood because the priesthood was not marrying Jewish women. They were marrying women who were foreigners that weren't even Jewish. And this was particularly sensitive in the priesthood. And so in Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 26, did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin regarding these things, marrying foreign women? Yet among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women caused even him to sin. Now, this was spoken of 500 years later, and he was using an example to bring up to the priests. See what happened here? And here was Solomon, and he even built the temple, but because he married these foreign wives, he eventually even committed idolatry and going and allowing temples to other gods to be built in the land and caused Israel to stumble much. And now here you are, priests, and we are coming back from all this stumbling that we had problems with, and God deported us, and now you're doing this? He says, this cannot stand, and you are making the priesthood stink and be a stench again. And so it was very important for these priests to have a proper wife and not to do the things that would damage Israel. But the problem is certain things that are done in a person's life stick to them and they stay. Please understand the difference between forgiveness and prudence. You can have somebody who embezzled money and they can pay back every penny and the church can forgive them, but that's forgiveness. But prudence would tell you he can't ever be a treasurer or a financial secretary in the church again. If you have somebody who didn't handle food preparation right, you can forgive them, but they're not going to be handling food anymore. You could have a situation where people do things that are like reckless driving, and they've had a lot of accidents, and they can make restitution, and they can repair cars, and they might have higher insurance penalties, but they're not going to drive the church van picking up kids. That's prudence. So you have to understand that just because someone's forgiven doesn't mean that things go back to the way they were. And there are some situations where if a pastor commits adultery, he's a pastor and he commits adultery, can't get back in. He's forgiven, but it's not prudent to have him as a pastor anymore. And believe me, friends, I know of what I speak because I followed a pastor who had to be deposed. And I went into that church and picked up the pieces and worked with the people and helped them get over their hurt. And it is a damaging thing for a pastor to commit adultery. It sticks to him. And so in our fellowship, if you commit adultery, you're never going to lose your reproach, just like it says here in Proverbs chapter 6. Now, the pastor, as a leader of families, must have this squared away. It says here in Titus, get it back to Titus, that's the passage we're preaching. If any man is above reproach, verse 6, the husband of one wife, having children who believe, not accused of dissipation or rebellion. So the pastor, as a leader of families, must have this area squared away. Irregularities in marriage or minor children's actions can call into question the pastor's ability to model the necessary characteristics in a leader. And there's also the 1 Timothy passage, chapter 3. It says a little bit more about that. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 4 and 5. He must be one who manages his own household well. Well, that could be how he handles the discipline of his children, how he handles his money, how he works with his wife, how he carries himself, and it says keeping his children under control with all dignity. But if a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? So a man's family is a little microcosm of the macrocosm of the church. A little family is a training ground and gives you skills and shows your skills for managing and working with a group of families. And they look at the pastor and they learn from him and how his family is doing. And so it's very important. And I would like to say that minor children, there have been many pastors who raise their children and they're doing very well, and they are showing that they're believers and they're behaving. And then maybe 20 years later, when they're well off on their own, they do something screwball. Well, you can't hold the pastor accountable for that. So we look at the minor children and how he deals with his family at that time. Now, when it comes here to Titus chapter 1, and it says, the husband of one wife. Well, many people are very inventive in how they want to translate that or interpret that. It literally is a one-woman man. And so there are 5 views that are prominent that I have to deal with. And I get my information from the pastoral epistles, studies in 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, written by Homer A. Kent Jr. He was a professor of mine at Grace Theological Seminary. This is understood as one of the best books available on the pastoral epistles. And he says that there's the Roman Catholic view of this, a one-woman man, but they interpret it as that the woman is the church, the bride of Christ, and that he is, in some sense or another, married to the church. So he doesn't have a mate. His bride of Christ is his wife, so to speak. And so the wife of the priest is the church. And so when they take their vows to be a priest, they are basically saying that they will never marry. That is not what is meant in this passage. That's a spin on this passage. And then there's the prohibition to a widower or elder to prohibition to remarry. So once your wife dies and you're an elder and your wife dies, you're only supposed to have one wife, a one-woman man. All it has to say is, but it doesn't say that. It says a one-woman man, meaning that he is true to his wife that he has. Now, some of you remember Josh and Autumn Miller, who were missionaries of our church. And Autumn Miller, her father was a pastor, had, I think, upwards of 4 or 5 children, and his wife passed away. And he believed that now he was disqualified from being a pastor because he didn't have a wife. So there are people that take that view, but I don't think that's a proper view. Priests whose wives died in the Old Testament were permitted to marry again. And you want to understand that there were also people that believed that you had to be married or you couldn't be an elder, such as this man. He had that view. But the Apostle Paul, he was an elder, and he was single. Timothy also, and Titus, we don't know that they had wives, never mentioned. And there is some thought that the Apostle Paul was a widower, but that's only a possibility. We don't know that that's necessarily true. And then, um, so that was the third view, exclusion of unmarried elders. If you are unmarried, you couldn't be an elder. Well, that doesn't, I don't think that's what that means either. The fourth, prohibition of polygamists. And certainly when it says a one woman man, um, you would think, well, maybe that includes that. But that doesn't exclusively explain everything that what that means. Polygamy was not a problem when this was written. There were a few Jewish people that had more than one wife. Kings had more than one wife. It wasn't a problem so much in the Roman Empire at the time. So this was not what that meant. There are other passages that speak against people being having more than one wife. Let each man have his own wife. Let each woman have her own husband. Well, that pretty much shuts it up to the legitimate way in which things are handled is that you have one wife and you have one husband. And he even encouraged young widows to get married. So if there's anything wrong with it, he would have said so at the time. And he says it's a good thing to get married if it's kind of a problem for you. And so there's nothing wrong with doing that sort of thing. And finally, you have the fifth view, which is a prohibition against divorce view or any other marital infidelity. And that's my view, that he was a man that was true to his wife, a one woman man. He's not a philanderer. He's not divorced. He's a good pattern for everybody else to follow. I'm not trying to make out that if somebody's divorced that they've done the unforgivable sin, but they are not to be an elder. And so, my friends, also in closing, one of the things that I would like to point out to you is that there is a problem that some people are weaseling, and that is that if a man is homosexual, but he has accountability and he swears off practicing it, can he be an elder? And my answer is no, he shouldn't be an elder any more than somebody that says, well, I have the propensity to be a fornicator. I'm a fornicator. I'm an adulterer. Oh, I'm married to one woman here, but I'm an adulterer. No, you can't be, if you have that mindset that God created you to be an adulterer and you're just keeping it under wraps. Now, we're not going to make you pastor any more than somebody says, well, I'm a homosexual, but I'm just keeping it under wraps. No, you confess that you eschew that lifestyle, that you are not that anymore, and it's not appropriate, and you don't say something like, I'm a homosexual, but I don't practice it, therefore take me into the ministry. No, can't do that. And you say, well, what's the big deal, Pastor? Well, In 2009 in September, this is an article from the World magazine, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America voted to allow lifelong, monogamous, publicly accountable homosexual clergy on its leadership roster. Well, it looks like they got it covered. No, they're homosexual. They're saying that they are homosexual, and would you please accept me to be a pastor? And I won't practice, but I'm homosexual. Well, friends, if he's homosexual by definition, then he wants you to somehow or another say that it's okay, and it's not okay. And the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America lost a number of churches over this, despite the fact that a vast majority of the people didn't want this. They went ahead and did it, and that was in 2009. This was repeated in other denominations as well. They thought, well, this was a pretty good idea, and they're paying for it now, and they're splitting. You can't have that. You get the camel's nose underneath the tent, and he's right there, and you let that camel's nose be in there. It's not long the whole camel slips in. And so, my friends, it's very important for us to hold the line that there is above reproach, and this person is a model for the family, or at least doesn't undermine it. They're not supposedly some cutesy, I'm a homosexual, but I don't practice. That's like saying I'm a fornicator and I'm an adulterer, but I'm not practicing. Hey, you can't let that. You can't wrap your mind around that. You can't let that camel's nose in the tent. Because, my friends, later on, you're going to pay. So it's very important for us to be proper when it comes to elders, and that they uphold proper conduct in marriage and the family. God bless you as you understand this passage, and may you understand it appropriately.